The air was thick with the sweet aroma of freshly baked apple pie as I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table. The warm, buttery crust melted in my mouth, a perfect contrast to the tartness of the Granny Smith apples. Grandfather Julius watched me with a contented smile, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of strong, black coffee. These were the moments I cherished most. Just the two of us, sharing stories and basking in the simple joys of each other's company. Growing up, grandfather was my anchor, a beacon of love and wisdom in an often chaotic world. He had an air of mystery about him, a depth in his piercing blue eyes that hinted at a life lived far beyond the confines of our sleepy, Midwestern town. As a child, I was endlessly fascinated by his heavily accented English and the exotic, European lilt to his words. He wove captivating tales of his youth spent roaming the cobblestone streets of his homeland, of the grand adventures he had and the colorful characters he met along the way. But there were also the stories he didn't tell, the ones that lingered in the shadows of his tightly guarded memories. I'd catch glimpses of them sometimes, a faraway look in his eyes, a pained expression that flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. In those moments, I sensed there was so much more to my grandfather than the kindly old man I adored. Little did I know, the key to unlocking his secrets lay hidden in the depths of a mysterious locked chest, one that would reveal a truth so horrifying it would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me. Julius Novak was a man of many mysteries. He rarely spoke of his life before coming to America, and when he did, his stories were vague and riddled with inconsistencies. What I managed to piece together over the years was that he had immigrated to the United States from an unnamed Eastern European country in the aftermath of World War II. He arrived with nothing more than a battered suitcase and a heart heavy with unspoken burdens. Whenever I pressed him for details about his experiences during the war, grandfather would grow suddenly distant, his eyes glazing over with a haunted expression. "Ah, Lieben, those were dark times," he would say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Best to let the past stay buried." And just like that, he'd change the subject, leaving me with more questions than answers. One thing that always struck me as odd was the large, ornate chest grandfather kept hidden away in the attic. It was an imposing piece, crafted from heavy, dark wood and adorned with intricate metalwork. The chest was always locked, and grandfather made it abundantly clear that it was strictly off limits. I remember sneaking up to the attic once as a child, my curiosity getting the better of me. I ran my fingers over the cool metal of the lock, imagining all the secrets that must be hidden inside. But before I could investigate further, grandfather caught me. The look of sheer panic on his face was enough to ensure I never went near the chest again. As grandfather grew older, his mind began to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid, prone to fits of anger and long bouts of depression. He would wake in the night screaming in a language I didn't understand, his body drenched in a cold sweat. It pained me to see him suffering, but no matter how much I tried to get him to open up, he remained stubbornly tight-lipped about his demons. It was a bitter, cold morning in January when I received the call. Grandfather had suffered a massive stroke and was not expected to survive. I rushed to the hospital, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I was about to lose the most important person in my life. When I arrived at his bedside, grandfather was a shell of his former self. His once vibrant blue eyes were dull and unfocused, his skin pale and papery thin. As I took his hand in mine, his grip was weak, almost non-existent. I fought back tears, knowing I needed to be strong for him in his final moments. "Lieben," he whispered, his voice hoarse and labored. "There's something I must tell you." I leaned in closer, my heart racing with a sickening combination of anticipation and dread. "What is it, grandfather?" His eyes filled with tears as he struggled to find the words. I am not the man you think I am. During the war, I did things, terrible things." I shook my head, not wanting to believe what I was hearing. "Grandfather, what are you saying?" "I was a prison guard," he choked out, his voice barely audible. "At a concentration camp, I helped them, the Nazis. God forgive me, I helped them." My blood ran cold as the weight of his words sank in. My beloved grandfather, a Nazi collaborator. It couldn't be true. It had to be the ravings of a dying man, his mind addled by illness and age. But then, with a trembling hand, grandfather reached into the pocket of his hospital gown and pressed something small and cold into my palm. "The key," he whispered, "to the chest. You must know the truth." And with that, he took one last shuddering breath and closed his eyes forever. I don't remember much about grandfather's funeral. The days following his death passed in a haze of grief and confusion. I went through the motions of accepting condolences and sorting through his belongings, all the while feeling like I was trapped in some surreal nightmare. Late one sleepless night, I found myself standing in front of the old attic chest, the key grandfather had given me clutched tightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, to leave the past buried along with all of grandfather's secrets, but I knew I couldn't live with the not knowing, the constant nagging questions that would haunt me for the rest of my days. With a deep breath and shaking hands, I inserted the key into the lock and turned. The mechanism released with a soft click and the lid of the chest creaked open, releasing a gust of stale, musty air. At first glance, the contents seemed innocuous enough. A stack of yellowed papers, a few tarnished war medals, a faded black and white photograph. But as I delved deeper, a sickening realization began to dawn on me. There, nestled among the artifacts of grandfather's past, was an SS officer's uniform, the fabric still crisp and the insignia glinting coldly in the dim light of the attic. Pinned to the breast was a silver skull and crossbones, the mark of the infamous Totenkopf unit. With trembling fingers, I lifted the uniform from the chest, bile rising in my throat as the undeniable truth washed over me. My grandfather, the man who had raised me with such love and tenderness, had been a member of one of the most notorious and sadistic groups within the Nazi regime. But it was the journal, tucked beneath the uniform, that would haunt my dreams for years to come. As I flipped through the pages, grandfather's neat, precise handwriting leapt out at me, each entry more horrifying than the last. The words blurred before my eyes as I read, my mind reeling with the sheer enormity of the atrocities he described. Excerpts. The screams of the prisoners echo in my ears long after the smoke from the crematorium has cleared. Their faces haunt my dreams, but I cannot show weakness. I am a loyal servant of the Reich, and I will do my duty no matter the cost. Today we began a new series of experiments on a fresh batch of subjects. The doctor seems pleased with the results, though I cannot bear to look at the twisted, mutilated bodies left in the wake of his research. They are not human, these wretched creatures that claw at the gates of their cages. They are vermin, fit only to be exterminated for the glory of the fatherland. And yet, in the quiet moments, I wonder, is this truly the righteous path? Or have we strayed into the very heart of darkness itself? The journal went on, each page a testament to the unspeakable cruelty and depravity of the Nazi regime. With each word, I felt a piece of my soul wither and die, the foundation of my identity crumbling beneath the weight of this terrible knowledge. How could the man I had loved and idolized my entire life have been capable of such heinous acts? How could I reconcile the image of the gentle, loving grandfather with the cold, ruthless monster that leered out at me from the pages of his journal? I wept then, great heaving sobs that tore through my body like a physical pain. I wept for the innocent lives lost, for the shattered illusions of my childhood, and for the dark, twisted roots of my family tree. In the days that followed, I pored over the contents of grandfather's chest, each new revelation more disturbing than the last. The photograph showed him posing with other SS officers, their faces twisted into cruel, mocking smiles as they stood over piles of emaciated corpses. The letters and documents bore witness to his willing participation in the machinery of death, his signature scrawled across orders for mass executions and lists of undesirables to be eliminated. But it was the detailed accounts of the medical experiments that broke me. Grandfather had not just been a passive observer, but an active participant in some of the most horrific acts of human experimentation ever conceived. He wrote of prisoners being subjected to gruesome surgeries without anesthesia, their organs removed while they were still alive and screaming. He described injecting inmates with lethal cocktails of drugs and chemicals, meticulously recording their agonized deaths in the name of science. He even boasted of assisting in the development of new and more efficient methods of mass extermination, taking perverse pride in the sheer scale of the slaughter. I became obsessed, spending every waking moment sifting through the horrors of grandfather's past. I neglected my job, my relationships, my own basic needs. Nothing else mattered anymore, only the all-consuming need to understand how this could have happened. How could the man who had taught me to love and to be kind have been capable of such monstrous cruelty? How could he have looked into the eyes of innocent men, women, and children and seen nothing but vermin to be exterminated? The more I read, the more I felt a creeping sense of complicity, a stain upon my very soul. I was the product of evil, the spawn of a man who had willingly participated in the greatest atrocity in human history. The blood of his victims ran through my veins, their screams echoed in the marrow of my bones. I became convinced that I was tainted, cursed by the sins of my grandfather. I withdrew from the world, cutting off contact with friends and loved ones. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone discovering the truth about my family, of seeing the disgust and revulsion in their eyes. And then the nightmares began. At first, it was just fleeting images, snippets of horror that jolted me awake in the dead of night. I would see flashes of emaciated faces staring out at me from behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow and accusing. I would hear the echoes of agonized screams, the sickening crunch of bones breaking under the weight of cruel boots. But as the weeks wore on, the dreams became more vivid, more terrifyingly real. I would find myself transported back in time, walking the blood-soaked grounds of the concentration camp. The stench of death and decay thickened my nostrils. I could feel the rough fabric of the SS uniform against my skin, the weight of the rifle in my hands as I herded terrified prisoners to their doom. And always, in the center of it all, was grandfather, but not the grandfather I had known and loved. This was a twisted, malevolent version of him, his once kind eyes now glinting with sadistic glee as he oversaw the atrocities unfolding around him. "You see, Lieben," he would hiss, his voice dripping with venom. "This is your legacy. This is the blood that runs through your veins. You can never escape it, never wash away the stain of what I have done." I would wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat and my heart pounding in my ears. But even in the light of day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the ghosts of grandfather's victims were following me, waiting for their chance to exact their revenge. It started with small things at first. Objects in my house would move on their own, appearing in different places than where I had left them. I would catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. But then the whispers began. I would hear them in the dead of night, a low, insistent murmuring in a language I didn't understand. I knew in my bones that it was the same language grandfather had screamed in his nightmares, the language of his victims crying out for justice from beyond the grave. The photos were the worst. I began to notice changes in the old family albums, subtle at first, then more and more grotesque. Grandfather's face would appear in pictures I knew he had never been in, his features twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. In some photos he would be in full SS regalia, the silver death's head grinning out at me from the glossy surface. I stopped looking in mirrors, unable to bear the sight of my own face. In every reflection, I saw echoes of grandfather staring back at me, his eyes full of malice and accusation. I was losing my mind, I was sure of it. The weight of grandfather's sins was crushing me, dragging me down into a bottomless pit of despair and madness. I knew I had to find a way to break free, to exorcise the demons that haunted me, but I had no idea where to turn, no one to confide in. And so I suffered in silence, a prisoner of my own guilt and shame, haunted by the ghosts of a past that refused to stay buried. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I felt myself slipping deeper and deeper into a pit of despair. The knowledge of grandfather's crimes weighed on me like a physical burden, crushing the air from my lungs and the light from my soul. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of his victims staring back at me, their mouths open in silent screams of agony. I would jolt awake, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably, the taste of bile burning in the back of my throat. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls and emails from concerned friends and family. I couldn't bear the thought of facing anyone, of seeing the disgust and revulsion in their eyes if they knew the truth about my lineage. I was consumed by guilt, eaten alive by the shame of what grandfather had done. How could I ever hold my head up in the world again, knowing that I was the descendant of a monster? How could I look at myself in the mirror, knowing that the same blood that had flowed through his veins now coursed through mine? I began to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some twisted gene or corrupted soul that I had inherited from him. Was I destined to follow in his footsteps, to succumb to the same darkness that had consumed him? The thought filled me with a sickening dread, a fear that I was tainted beyond redemption. I turned to alcohol to numb the pain, to quiet the screaming in my head. I would drink until I blacked out, until the world faded away and I could forget, even for a moment, the horror of my own existence. But always the ghosts would find me. They would whisper to me in the darkness, their voices filled with accusation and rage. "Murderer," they would hiss. "Nazi scum. You're no better than he was. You have his blood, his evil inside you." I began to contemplate ending it all, of finding some way to silence the voices forever. I would sit for hours with grandfather's old service pistol in my lap, the cold metal heavy and seductive against my skin. It would be so easy, I thought, to just slip away into oblivion, to find the peace that had eluded me for so long. But something always held me back, some tiny flicker of light in the darkness that refused to be extinguished. Maybe it was the memory of grandfather's love, twisted and tainted as it was. Maybe it was some stubborn shred of hope that I could somehow find a way to atone for his sins. Or maybe it was the growing realization that I owed it to his victims to bear witness, to ensure that the truth of what he had done would never be forgotten. I was the only one who knew, the only one who could carry the weight of this terrible knowledge. And so I endured, even as the ghosts grew more insistent and the darkness threatened to swallow me whole. I clung to that tiny spark of light, that fragile hope that somehow, someday, I would find a way to make things right. It was a night like any other, the shadows long and deep and the silence heavy as a shroud. I sat in grandfather's old armchair, the leather cracked and worn beneath my fingers, a bottle of whiskey clutched in my trembling hand. I had lost track of how long I had been sitting there, lost in the swirling depths of my own misery. The ghosts had been particularly relentless that night, their whispers filling my head until I thought I would go mad from the sheer weight of their despair. And then, suddenly, he was there, grandfather, standing before me in full SS regalia, his face a twisted mask of rage and hatred. The room grew cold, the air heavy with the stench of death and decay. "You stupid meddling girl," he hissed, his voice like ice water down my spine. "You couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? You had to go digging up the past, stirring up things best left buried." I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Choked off by the terror that gripped me, grandfather loomed over me, his eyes burning with a hellish light. "I gave you everything," he snarled. "I loved you, protected you, and this is how you repay me, by dragging my name through the mud, by exposing my secrets to the world." He reached for me then, his fingers like claws, ready to rip the life from my body. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey, paralyzed by the sheer force of his malevolence. "You will pay for your betrayal," he growled, his hands closing around my throat. "You will suffer as I have suffered, and then you will join me in hell where you belong." I could feel the life draining from me, my vision clouding as I gasped for air. The world began to fade away, the edges of reality blurring into a haze of pain and terror. And then, somewhere deep inside me, a spark of defiance flared to life, a tiny, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of grandfather's overwhelming evil. "No," I choked out, my voice little more than a whisper. "I won't let you win. I won't let your darkness consume me." With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I wrenched myself free from his grasp, staggering back against the wall. Grandfather let out a roar of rage, his features twisting into a grotesque mask of fury. "You can't escape me," he bellowed, his voice shaking the very foundations of the house. "You are mine now and forever, my blood, my legacy, my curse." But even as he spoke, I could feel the power of my own will rising up to meet him, a white-hot fury, born of pain and despair, a determination to break free from the chains of the past. "I am not yours," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I am my own person, and I choose the light. I choose to remember the man you were, not the monster you became, and I choose to dedicate my life to making sure that your crimes, and the crimes of all those like you, are never forgotten." Grandfather let out a final, agonized howl, his form beginning to flicker and fade. The room grew warmer, the oppressive darkness lifting like a veil. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice little more than a whisper on the wind. "You will never be free of me, never be free of the stain upon your soul." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence, my heart racing and my mind reeling from the confrontation. I woke the next morning on the floor of the living room, my body aching and my head pounding with the worst hangover of my life. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. And then it all came rushing back. The ghostly visitation, the confrontation with grandfather, the searing pain of his hands around my throat. I sat up slowly, wincing at the bright sunlight streaming through the windows. It took me a moment to register what I was seeing. There, in the center of the room, was a small pile of ashes, still smoldering slightly in the morning air. The chest, and all its terrible contents, had been reduced to nothing more than a heap of charred rubble. I stared at the ashes for a long moment, my mind struggling to process the implications of what I was seeing. Had it all been a dream, a vivid hallucination brought on by too much whiskey and too little sleep? Or had I truly been visited by the ghost of my grandfather, a final, desperate attempt to keep his secrets buried forever? I didn't know, and in a way, it didn't matter. The chest was gone, but the knowledge of what it had contained would stay with me forever. I was the keeper of grandfather's legacy now, the one who bore the weight of his crimes. I stood on shaky legs, my mind spinning with unanswered questions and unresolved doubts. I knew that I couldn't go on living as I had been, haunted by the ghosts of the past and consumed by my own guilt and despair. I had to find a way to confront the truth head on, to shine a light into the darkest corners of my family's history. I owed it to grandfather's victims, to the millions who had suffered and died at the hands of the Nazis. I owed it to myself, to find some way to make peace with the burden I now carried. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that. The road ahead would be long and painful, filled with difficult truths and uncomfortable revelations. But I also knew that I had no choice. I had to face the demons of the past, to learn from them and to grow beyond them. And so, with a heavy heart and a determined spirit, I set out on the path to discovery, to uncover the full extent of my grandfather's crimes, and to find some way to atone for them. I didn't know where the journey would lead me, or what I would find along the way, but I knew that I had to try. In the years that followed, I threw myself into the task of researching grandfather's past with a fierce determination. I spent countless hours poring over old records and archives, tracking down every lead and every scrap of information I could find. What I uncovered was a story even more horrifying than I could have imagined. Grandfather had not just been a guard at the concentration camp. He had been a high-ranking officer responsible for overseeing some of the most brutal and sadistic acts of torture and experimentation ever inflicted upon human beings. He had personally selected prisoners for the gas chambers, had overseen the execution of entire families. He had stood by and watched as innocent men, women, and children were starved, beaten, and worked to death in the name of a twisted ideology. The more I learned, the more I felt the weight of his crimes pressing down upon me. How could I ever make sense of the fact that the man I had loved so dearly had been capable of such unimaginable evil? How could I reconcile the memories of his kindness and generosity with the cold, hard truth of his actions? And even more chilling was the knowledge that grandfather was far from alone. As I dug deeper into the history of the war, I began to uncover a vast network of former Nazis who had escaped justice, fleeing to the far corners of the world to start new lives and new identities. They were everywhere, these men who had committed some of the worst atrocities in human history. They were our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends. They were the kindly old men who sat next to us on the bus, the respected pillars of the community who served on local boards and committees. It was a terrible realization, a weight that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. How could we ever truly come to terms with the legacy of the war when so many of its perpetrators had simply slipped away into the shadows, their crimes forgotten and unpunished? And what about the next generation, the children and grandchildren of these men who had never faced the consequences of their actions? Were we doomed to inherit their guilt, to carry the stain of their sins for all eternity? These were the questions that haunted me, the doubts and fears that kept me up at night. I knew that I could never truly escape the specter of my grandfather's crimes, that they would always be a part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being. But I also knew that I had a choice. I could let the darkness consume me, could allow myself to be dragged down into the same pit of despair and hatred that had claimed grandfather, or I could choose to fight, to use the knowledge I had gained to make some small difference in the world. And so I made a vow to myself, a promise that I would spend the rest of my life working to expose the truth about the war and its aftermath. I would tell the stories of the victims, would honor their memories and ensure that their suffering was never forgotten. It would not be an easy path, I knew that. There would be resistance, both from those who sought to bury the past and from my own inner demons. But I also knew that it was the only way forward, the only way to find some measure of peace and redemption. And so I set out on my journey, armed with the truth and a fierce determination to never let the ghosts of the past rest. I didn't know what the future would hold, or what challenges I would face along the way, but I knew that I would keep fighting, keep pushing forward, until the very end, for the sake of the victims, for the sake of the generations to come, and for the sake of my own soul, forever haunted by the legacy of a man I had once called grandfather.